Well, singers, you asked, and I promised that I was going to answer. So I'm a little bit excited about this departure from my typical format. At the same time, however, when I opened up the floor for you to ask your questions, I had not anticipated it being this challenging. So when I did invite you to pose your questions, I explained then that I wanted to just be able to give you some quick tips, exercises, whatever it might be, to help you, and then if need be, I would create entire videos on those particular subjects if I need to delve a little bit more deeply into them. So a lot of you asked some really great questions, but all of them were really complex questions at the same time. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer them succinctly. And I'm definitely not going to be able to get into the kind of detail that I would like to get into as I typically do in my other videos, but please bear with me, be patient with me. So I just want to let you know that I have my laptop set up here on my piano, and on that laptop I have all of your questions written out, as well as some little points that I want to make sure I don't forget. So if I look away from the camera for a minute, I promise it's not because I don't want to look at you, all of you beautiful people. It's because I need to keep myself on track. So without further ado, let's tackle some of these questions one at a time, shall we? And I'm going to do my best to try to get through this quickly as possible. So the first question comes from Sean, who asked, and now I feel a little bit like one of those kids television show hosts when they read the kids' letters on air. Kids letters. So Sean asks, what are some helpful exercises that can help access head voice with support, no tension, and proper chord closure/resonance, especially for a baritone? Well, Sean, that altogether depends on where you're starting from technically. Under normal circumstances, I would want to hear you sing and observe you singing and be able to sort of diagnose what is at the root of your not being able to access head voice or not be able to sing with a really developed sound, a very coordinated, full-voiced sound. If you are able to access the lighter mechanism of the voice, that is M2, whether it's falsetto or head voice or a hoot, woohoo! Then we can work with that. There's a lot we can do with that. So how I would help my students develop their head voice would depend a little bit on their aesthetic, the aesthetic that they're aiming for, whether it's classical or commercial. And even within the commercial genres, there are different kinds of aesthetics between, let's say, musical theater and rock. So it would really altogether depend. So again, I'm going to assume for the time being that you have access to the lighter mechanism of the voice. It's just not, for whatever reason, developed. There's maybe a poor transition between the lower mechanism and the higher mechanism, between M1, M2, chest voice, head voice, whatever you want to call it. So I described an exercise, that old dove coo exercise, which is great for that low larynx, more classical kind of sound. But as I explained in that video, it's really good for us to train it both ways, because then that way we can counter that tendency for the larynx to rise too much. It can rise, it's okay in commercial styles, but there's a point at which it becomes too high and the singer feels as though he or she is like choking or being strangled, and the sound isn't usually very pleasant. So we can try that old dove coo, coo, coo kind of sound. Coo, 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 coo. Coo, 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 coo. Coo, 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 coo. And the aim here is to keep the timbre very consistent from the lower notes to the higher notes in the range. Now, if you're working on trying to sort of connect more fully at the glottal level, you can add a little bit of like a y sound in there and almost make it like you're saying ew, q, 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 q. You can use kind of a French tu or a German für kind of sound as well. Q, 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 q. It's a little bit different of a sound. It's going to feel very kind of closed up here, sort of in the back of the mouth, but it can help with glottal closure. So same exercise. Q, 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 Q. 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 And you hear how the sound is a little bit brighter, a little bit sharper. That's going to give you a little bit more of that CCM kind of aesthetic, more so than classical. Not that you couldn't use it in classical either. Now for building resonance, I love any of those nasalized sounds, the M, N, N, G, Those are really great, not because you want the sound to be going through your nose per se, but because they help to sort of cue the body to this sensation of resonance in the supraglottal vocal tract. And that can be really good. In classical singing, I know my teacher used to talk about sort of grounding the tone, this feeling that it just kind of helps us to sort of find that coordination and how we want that sound to sort of start. And then continue. And anything with, you know, like you can do sirens or little glides or slides. Or I think I've done this exercise before. To sit on that that NG for a little bit of time, just so you can really feel that sense of resonance. Staccato can also be really helpful at getting better glottal closure, and so I like to alternate between staccato and legato, and then the idea is to sort of transfer that connectedness from the staccato portion into the legato portion and keep the vocal folds nice and connected. Let's see, something like and it should really feel the same. The key here though is when you're singing in head voice is to create space, the right kind of space. How we shape our vocal tract is different depending on the phonemes and the aesthetic that we're going for and what coordination we're applying to it. But we still want a sense of openness. It's not going to be as open in commercial styles as it is going to be in classical, but we just want this nice feeling of release inside the throat, even though, yes, the throat is doing work. All right, so let's move along. Someone else asked a similar question regarding head voice development. Could you show/explain how to do some exercises that can help with learning the right singing technique for very high notes? And she elaborates here that she's really referring to the notes in the uppermost part of the range above C6 and how to sing them with an openness and freedom in the throat and a stable larynx. All right, so really what you're referring to here is likely the whistle register. For most females, we move into the whistle register and whistle tones around that C6, D6 area. There are some singers who are able to avoid whistle tones for several more notes beyond that, but that's typical around that you know, C6, D6 area for most of us. And it's kind of an interesting thing because it's, even though a lot of people feel like the whistle register is really just kind of an extension of the head register in terms of coordination, it definitely has a unique vibratory coordination in that as we move higher and higher in pitch, the vocal folds become increasingly damped. So less and less of the vocal fold is set into vibration. And so really there is just the anterior portion, the front portion of the vocal folds that's vibrating, and there's a little tiny gap in the back of the glottis through which air passes and helps to create that whistle sound. So when you're singing in that upper range, because the vocal folds are so damped, you're probably going to find that it feels very different from a full voice. It doesn't have the presence and the substance that you might be used to experiencing. The key here is like any other high note, really, it's just to allow space to keep things from really closing down. The larynx will rise at that point. For most females, the larynx starts to rise maybe around A5, so a little bit below that. That is perfectly normal, it is healthy, it's not going to be problematic unless that laryngeal elevation is accompanied by a supraglottal squeezing. That's where the problem starts to come in. So you also have to ask yourself, why do you want to develop this whistle register? We're not going to use it in repertoire unless we are Ariana Grande or Mariah Carey. We're probably not going to need notes above C6. But I always encourage students, singers, to develop this whistle register, not because they're going to use it, not because it's going to be a fantastic party trick that they can perform for all their friends, but because when they are exercising the voice in its fullest range, they are going to encourage that vocal instrument to remain elastic and flexible. And the benefit of that, beyond it, is that everything below that is going to be that much easier to sing and that much more developed So it is a good idea for us to work on developing our whistle register. So again, when we're talking about laryngeal stability, we're not talking about the larynx being fixed in a low position for all phonemes and all pitches. Again, it's okay for the larynx to rise, but what we want to do is we want to maintain this feeling of openness and spaciousness inside the throat. So you can try glissandos and sirens, anything that's going to stretch the vocal instrument, encourage you to sing those pitches, but when you do it, you have to make sure that you get this nice inhale posture in the throat with a little bit of an inside the throat. That just really represents that nice open neutral posture of the throat. And also you can try things like ingressive phonation, in which you make sound on the inhale. Now you can try scales and even vocal phrases using this kind of inhaled ingressive phonation. And it's a little bit weird, but the nice thing about it is that it encourages an openness because you're inhaling, so the vocal instrument is automatically put into this inhale posture and it remains there. And what we want to do ideally is to transfer that openness to egressive phonation, to when we're singing on the exhale. And so we can flip-flop back and forth between them. My own whistle tones, my own whistle register is not very well developed and I'm still sick. So I am not going to bother trying to demonstrate this for you because it's not very pretty. I can sing in the whistle tones, but yeah, not so pretty. So, but yeah, just keep that in mind, that just spaciousness, freedom, not pushing too much in here because the vocal folds are so damped. You actually don't need a lot of airflow. There's more transglottal airflow because there's a little bit of a gap there in the glottis, but you don't need a ton of subglottal pressure when you're singing in whistle tones. So let's move along to Patricia's question, and she asks if we should try transitioning through the break by encouraging either lightness through the break and then returning to full energy once past it, or approaching it with loudness and energy in order to train the CT muscles to become stronger so as to match the tone of the last notes in the TA coordination. And this question kind of ties a little bit into Elizabeth's question about how to fix severe register breaks or cracks in the voice when transitioning from mixed voice to head voice. So let me just talk a little bit briefly about the voice system. The voice system is tripartite. There are three parts to it. There is the motor, which is our breathing mechanism, all the muscles involved in that. And then there is the vibrator, that's the vocal fold vibration. And then we have the resonator. That's the supraglottal vocal tract that shapes and tunes and amplifies the sound that's created at the glottal level with that vocal fold vibration, the sound source. And so the idea here is we need to have everything in balance, all three of those parts. So the subglottal pressures match that of the glottal resistance efforts, and the glottal resistance efforts are not interfering in any way with the supraglottal shaping and vice versa. So we shape our supraglottal vocal tracts in such a way as to encourage an energy efficiency between the two. So the vocal folds feed acoustic energy to the supraglottal vocal tract, which in turn feeds energy back to the vocal folds in order to help sustain their vibration. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that everything is shaped and tuned appropriately to allow the vocal instrument a chance to just operate as efficiently as possible, regardless of the dynamics at which we're singing or the pitches. So what we really want to do when we're transitioning between registers is we want to match the levels of closed quotient. That's the amount of time that the vocal folds are touching during each vibratory cycle of the vocal folds. We want to be able to match those levels of closed quotient between M1 and M2, chest voice, head voice. And how we do that is not how we're often trained to do it. So we're typically, and the tendency that we typically have is to get louder and louder and louder and increase our intensity more and more and more. Intensity is not a problem, but what happens is we get to the top of our chest registers and we have nowhere to go because we can't make the bottom portion of our head registers as loud. There's not as much thyroarytenoid muscle involved in it, so we're not going to have the substance and the presence. So what we have to do is, I kind of use this car ramp analogy, which hopefully will be effective for you. But so again, if we picture this as our chest register, and this is our head register, can put it up like this if you want to. So there's a car moving up here, and it's working harder and harder and harder and harder. And then it gets to this point where it has no place to go but to plummet. So ideally, what we want to do, I'll lose my light. What we want to do is to bring the upper portion of our chest register down just a little bit in terms of the closed quotient. So releasing a little bit of that, releasing some of the glottal compression, managing our subglottal pressures, not allowing them to continually get higher and higher and higher. And then bring the lower portion of our head registers, our M2 coordination, up a little bit. So now we have an effective bridge, and everything flows very, very smoothly between the two. And it's a little bit tricky because, again, it involves balancing all three aspects or all three parts of the vocal tract. So for me, I always kind of use this analogy of, the accelerator pedal in the car, right? We don't want to just keep pushing down further and further and further with the accelerator pedal. It's easy. It helps us to stay in that coordination. It helps us to belt. It helps us to stay in a mix. But it becomes problematic if we're not also matching that increased subglottal pressure with increased resistance efforts. And so it all comes in balance, and really it's a matter of, I think, not just kind of singing the scale like you normally do, but really approaching it very thoughtfully and very deliberately, listening to the notes. Do they sound like they're in balance? Can I continue going up the scale in this exact same coordination exactly like I am? Or am I going to get to the point where something's got to give? So what we need to do is we need to make graduated adjustments as we go up the scale on every single note. And I always say that you really, when you get to this, you have to anticipate. You have to anticipate those adjustments several notes before you get to your break or your register transition point. Because if you wait till you're here, it's too late. The change is going to be abrupt. So you need to kind of mediate that a little bit. You need to anticipate those adjustments and make them along the way. All right, let's see. We have, I also should mention too that a lot of register breaks, in fact, I would say a good portion of them, are actually caused by resonance imbalances. And I know I mentioned about having everything tuned effectively, but if your supraglottal vocal tract is not tuned, it is not in tune with the pitch that you're singing, the harmonics that it's producing, then you may get little glitches in the vocal fold vibration because they're not helping each other to operate very effectively or efficiently. Just keep that in mind. You have to work on your resonance. So Dennis asked, how can I make my mix less heavy? I feel like I'm pulling too much chest in my mix and I don't know how to add more head resonance instead of chest. And Sunit, and I hope I got your name right, asked a question about over-supporting below the passaggio, causing either an awkward shift in the upper register or the voice getting stuck in the throat at the break. And that's really kind of goes back to the last two questions that I just answered, that car ramp analogy, just making these adjustments, just graduated adjustments moving at the scale. And for me, I feel like when I'm trying to avoid register breaks, thankfully I don't really have them anymore. I never really had a break. I always had sort of like a weak spot where my voice just sort of was kind of, but keeping the loudness as consistent as possible as you move the scale. It may get a little bit louder, and that's all right, but what we don't want is this sense of the voice becoming increasingly strident and getting shouty and unmanageable. So, so if you're singing something like, let's see, I'm gonna move up to here. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. So as I'm moving higher and I'm approaching my break, I am consciously trying to keep my loudness in check. And I'm trying to make some necessary adjustments. And what you may find is that you might kind of sort of keep that adjustment in or the loudness in check, but then things might break a little bit, or they might get a little unstable and wobbly, and then you need to make different types of adjustments there. It doesn't mean you have to get louder in order to stay in that coordination. You might need to adjust your vowel. You might need to adjust how you shape the pharynx and the length or the width of it. And you just have to kind of experiment a little bit with it. But really a lot of this has to do with being far more conscious of what we're doing. When we're in a performance, it's a different story altogether. Nobody wants to see us thinking about what we're doing technically. But now, when you're in your lessons, when you're in your private practice time, now is the time to be thoughtful and to be really focused on this sort of thing. I also love things like top-down approaches. These are very, very effective because what they do is they start you out above that break or passaggio area, and they bring that lighter mechanism down. And that can kind of help to sort of balance out that middle portion of the range or that break area where maybe you have a little bit too much vocal effort happening. So the idea with a top-down approach is to not only start above the passaggio in this lighter mechanism of the voice, but also to sing descending patterns. And that's going to prevent you from pulling chest, because typically we pull chest when we're in ascending patterns. Now we have to be careful that we're not getting stuck in this lighter mechanism, in this M2, which happens quite a bit. So we want to reintroduce more glottal resistance. We want to reintroduce more chest voice gradually as we move down in the scale, but we don't want to clunk. We don't want to just kind of dig into the sound and say, I can sing in chest voice now, and just kind of do it like that. Again, graduated adjustments. Start to anticipate that in the descending pattern. So again, you can sing any kind of descending pattern. Or something like ming, 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 ming. I like that one. And also when it comes to developing your upper range, you have to make sure first that your upper, middle, and middle portions of your range are also solidified. That's really important. If your technique is not solidified in that middle and upper middle portion of your range, your head voice is not going to be developed. So focus primarily on that, and what will happen is over time, that upper range will start to release almost on its own. One day you'll probably just notice all of a sudden that you have freedom and release in the vocal instrument and power that you didn't know you had. And Philip asks, I am a tenor trying to lighten my voice as I go from the mid-range through the passaggio to the top. Any help/exercises would be great. My tendency has been to push and get louder, which means I'm carrying too much chest voice up toward the top. It then becomes difficult to access the head tones. And Ruvim, and I hope I got your name right, asked, how do you support better and reduce the tendency to push too much air when going higher/belting? Well, really, I probably should have included these two questions with the earlier questions, similar questions. And it really just goes back to that car ramp analogy, just learning to be able to sort of consciously control your loudness and being able to kind of ease off a little bit on it. Briefly, I'll just share my own experience. At one point I decided that I really needed to develop a mixed voice because I didn't have one, and I wanted to learn how to belt. And initially when I started singing, I really pushed a lot and I used a lot of vocal effort, and it was shouty. It was really unmusical because I really had no place to go with it musically. I didn't have a vibrato. I wasn't able to alter the colors or the tones yet. I just wasn't there technically. But what happened over time was, as my coordination started to improve, I found that I was able to sort of ease off just a little bit. And if I ease off too much, the voice would get kind of unstable and wobbly, and then I would kind of add a little bit more intensity and go back to that coordination that I was a little more familiar with. And I kept kind of doing that, and as I eased off a little bit, and the voice got wobbly, I would try to make some adjustments. I would change my vowel a little bit, modify it a little bit, and I would adjust my breath pressure. I would try to ease off in the breath pressure, but not so much that I would lose that stability in the voice. And over time, that range, I'm still working on it, but that range has become a lot more stable and a lot more consistent, and I'm more and more able to control the colors, the qualities of it, the dynamics, and it's capable of some vibrato. And really it just is a matter of being conscious about your technique, actively avoiding that tendency to want to shout and to push with the voice. Initially you may have to be perfectly honest, initially you may have to kind of in order to get that coordination, be a little bit louder, a little bit unmusical, but over time that coordination will start to develop further. And also that top-down approach is really good because again, when we're going in ascending patterns, we have a tendency to pull chest, to get louder, to increase our intensity. And for some singers, they have a lot of trouble sort of easing off and figuring out and finding that balance. And though for those singers, they're better off doing these top-down approaches temporarily. And then you could take the top-down approach and go in the descending pattern, but then immediately go in the ascending pattern and try to keep the coordination the same as you move through that scale. Bronchitis. All right, getting over it, but not there yet.